So I would like to give a specific example of the experience of going beyond forms from the Snowmass Interspiritual Dialogue. To give a brief history of it, it was founded in 1984 by Father Thomas Keating, and the idea was to bring together people from different wisdom traditions to speak not just for their tradition or about their tradition, but really to speak from their personal experience of how they had been transformed and how their tradition had helped them in this transformative process. And so they gathered a Japanese Zen monk and a Tibetan Buddhist, and Father Keating is a Catholic monk. They had a Protestant minister at the time, a Sufi representative, a representative from the Vedanta Hindu tradition, and a few others, and a Native American, Grandfather Red Elk. And at the beginning, they met for a week each year, and for the first 20 years, they decided that they would be completely private. They didn't record any of their conversations. They did not publicize anything. And they wanted to have the freedom to speak not from their traditions, but from their personal experience. And what they found was that it took a big investment of time up front. So the first 3-4 years, they weren't sure they would have anything in common when they got together. And it really required them to form very deep friendships with each other, really fall in love with each other on a personal level, before they could really begin to get into what was happening through each of their wisdom traditions, which really meant they had to get to a point where they could really share their lives openly with each other and trust each other to hold what was most sacred for them in their lives in order to really begin the dialogue process. And once they did, they found, to their great surprise and their great joy, that they had a lot in common. They tried to put some of these down in what's known as the points of agreement that came out of the Snowmass Interspiritual Dialogue. Those were recounted by Brother Wayne Teasdale in his book, The Mystic Heart, and have been used as a blueprint in a lot of ways for some subsequent dialogues and interfaith and interspiritual dialogues since that time. They consisted of essentially affirming that there is an ultimate reality, that the human being has the potential to transform and mature in cooperation and participation with that ultimate reality, that this requires a practice and a discipline in order to do it. So eventually, after 20 years, the founders decided they would begin inviting some mentees to begin to lead them through this dialogue process that they had found. So after discovering what they had in common through their points of agreement, they began to really step over some tricky ground, which was the differences, the real differences that existed between the wisdom traditions. And what they found was they didn't find answers necessarily for these differences, but that they bonded more as human beings and in their friendship and in their depth of sharing and expression through these differences more than they did over the commonalities. And that was very surprising to them at the time. Then, eventually, starting about 2005, they began to invite mentees into their dialogue process. Each member invited a few, 1 or 2 mentees to come and join them for the dialogue, and they modeled the dialogue process for them and then put them through the dialogue process themselves in order to pass on their wisdom. What they found was they had created such a reservoir of energy and a center of gravity that the new people that came in there very easily began to fall into a sense of camaraderie and a sense of dialogue that they hadn't experienced before. This included people who had never met people from another wisdom tradition, people who had been very experienced in interfaith dialogue before, but to this day, I believe all the participants that I know that had participated felt they found a level of dialogue that they hadn't quite experienced before. And maybe it'll be helpful to share one example of how that brought some of the people there beyond form. So in a recent year, the process goes that the mentees are also asked to form points of dialogue among themselves. And as they do this, they find that at the beginning, there's usually a sense that they have quite a bit in common. There's a lot of talk of us all being one and us all being fellow compatriots on the transformative journey. But as you actually begin to dialogue about it, as you actually begin to try and put into words what your common agreements are, inevitably differences come up. Human dynamics come up, group dynamics come up. Tensions emerge among the group and come to the foreground quite quickly. And what the participants found and what the members have found is that it brings you to a point where you feel this deep, palpable friendship and love with the other people, but you aren't able to necessarily come to an intellectual understanding of how your wisdom tradition and how the theologies and the dogmas and the framework you are using to understand your experience in the world relate to each other. And at that point, if the friendship and the desire to find companionship with each other is strong enough, something breaks open. You realize that you want to connect so deeply and share yourself with the other, but trying to put it into words and trying to put it into language doesn't always work. And at that moment, when something breaks, something very sacred is released. Out of that place of vulnerability and that place of failure, really, comes a grace, comes a very palpable energy that emerges and that is experienced and felt by everyone there. And they find themselves in this kind of field of communion that is beyond words, but which it took the words in order for them to get there. And they realize that they are having this kind of common experience together, and that in that is a unity, is the communion they were looking for. It just wasn't be able to express and be articulated in a framework and a theological vision that they could all share with one another. I think it's an ongoing experiment where we go from that kind of experience of communion with one another. As a first step, that experience is there. Whether or not it may or may not lead to an understanding we can all share is perhaps less important than actually undergoing that experience, which is transformative in itself and lets us know that the basic makeup of who we are as human beings and our basic desire for communion with each other and with the divine is the same.